Hello everyone, my name is Deacon Richard Hudzik and I'm here to present to you the next installment of Diakonia, a call to service. Diakonia, of course, is a Greek word. It is the root word of deacon. It also indicates the word service. And it's my privilege today to share with you on this periodic broadcast of Diakonia. We're going to speak today with Deborah Kanter, who is hailing in from the great state of Michigan. I think you were up in Michigan this morning. Deborah is an accomplished author, an academic, and we'll figure out exactly who you are. But welcome, Deborah, and let us begin. So how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's
Good.
nice to be in Chicago, even though I'm in Michigan.
You're virtually,
So,
okay. So tell us who you are. What's your academic career at the moment?
so I retired from college teaching, which I did for 30 years at a small college in Michigan. I taught Latino and Latin American history, and I started off doing history of Mexico, and gradually worked my way into doing U.S. Latino and Catholic history.
Now, what was the attraction for the study of Mexican history?
It was partly Mexico, just sort of got my
Mm-hmm.
attention, and visiting there as a college student. And this was in the early 80s. At the same time, I would come home to visit Chicago in the 80s and was just kind of amazed to see how neighborhood after neighborhood was changing in Chicago. The city was becoming más y más Mexicano every time I would visit.
Mm-hmm.
And the study that I was doing in Mexico and Chicago, things seemed to be maybe connecting. And when I finished my first book on Mexico, then I felt I had the freedom to start studying Mexico and Chicago,
Interesting. So
which is
you are a Chicagoan way back when, or
right.
an
So I was
Oak Parkian.
born at Michael Reese and raised in Oak Park.
Okay, good. So we've invited you to come down in a couple weeks to speak to the Hispanic Deacon Association. So you're back on familiar ground. Now you mentioned you've got 3 books to your credit, as I understand it, and I'm sure of a raft of academic papers and various journals here and there. This first book, Hijos del Pueblo, Gender, Family, and Community in Rural Mexico. Oh, there we go. Okay, now what is that?
Okay. So this is a study about rural Mexico, 18th, 19th century. I was wondering what it meant to be an indigenous person after a couple hundred years of rule by the Spanish. What was going on with language, what was going on with gender in what were called pueblos de indios, indigenous villages. Most Mexicans were rural dwellers, and that was what I did my PhD work in. Spent a lot of time reading historic court documents from the 18th century, written by hand. Yep, there it is. And I part of what motivated me to actually finish it, like, and get it published, was I started my project that became Chicago Catolico, and I knew that if I was ever gonna get the Chicago Catolico book published, I was gonna have to publish the first one on Mexico. But in the end, there have been lots and lots of connections. I worked a fair amount with ecclesiastical documents. It's some of the best sources that we have from Mexico in the colonial period. They come out of churches.
Wow.
And so I was familiar with a lot of things about Mexican religiosity, what it meant to be a bishop, what it meant to be in a rural parish, the connections between them, the liturgical calendar, and things like that.
Now that must have been a monumental work. I mean, it's no mean undertaking to talk about life over the course of over 100 years. Good.
Yeah, it was a lot, and it was sometimes a little hard to connect to, with the time period in which I was working, the 1990s, the early 2000s. I published it in 2009. I kept visiting Chicago, and I'd be like waiting on L platforms and talking to people in Spanish and starting to go visit churches. And I perceived there was some connection,
Mhm.
but it took me a long time to be able to voice that.
Yeah, and that's
And
that.
also, as somebody trained in Mexican history, at the time we were supposed to work on south of the border.
Mhm.
And it was only in time, in part because of teaching and in part because of increased immigration, that I felt comfortable becoming sort of a transnational or border crossing scholar.
Mm.
And it's one of the big arguments of my career for the last 2 decades is like studying Mexico in Chicago or Mexico in New York or Mexico in Detroit. This is all really valid and important, and the two countries are very linked.
Now, just a
So
question, that Hijos del Pueblo, that book is in English or is that in Spanish?
it's in
Oh,
English.
okay, okay, okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about coming back to Chicago in the study and seeing the increased uh, influx of Hispanic culture in Chicago. I wanted to make that connection because your next project is Chicago Catolico. Now, in brief, what is that? What's that book? Let me see if I can. You held up.
You can hold it up.
There we go.
I'll put mine down.
Okay.
So, Chicago Catolico sort of came out of that curiosity of how Chicago had been changing. There were hundreds of thousands of people from Mexico, their descendants. They were taking over parish after parish in Chicago. And I was wondering, what was Mexican identity, 2,000 miles north of the border? And I decided I was doing work at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and I decided I would escape the Newberry for a week to go to the Archdiocese Archive.
Hmm.
And, would I find anything on Mexican churches? And I sort of spent the next 20 years in the
Is that right? Is
archives,
that right? So you did.
or in the churches for that
So
matter.
you
So.
did end up finding some resources in the archives.
Lots of
Yeah.
resources. And one of the things that was really exciting about making the change from working on the colonial stuff, where I had been working on people, who passed away 150, 200 years ago, with the Chicago Catolico project, I was working a lot with people where this was their own story or the story of their parents. And so a lot of what really makes the Chicago Catolico book really lively is I conducted a lot of oral histories. I interviewed a lot of people who grew up in the first Mexican parishes in Chicago. I interviewed some of the first Mexicano people who moved into neighborhoods like Pilsen in the 1950s. And I also interviewed some clergy members who were at parishes precisely at the point that they were moving from, one dominant ethnic group to Spanish speaking parishioners.
Now, what's the
So
first?
I
What?
got to know a lot of people
Yeah.
in writing this book.
Well, that's good. What is the first significant presence of Mexican population in the Chicago area in the Midwest?
So while there's, recorded presence that goes back into the 19th century, I think the story really is the end of World War One. There were Mexican workers who were coming up to work in certain areas, particularly recruited into the railroads. And by like the early 1920s, you have neighborhoods or blocks where you've got, significant numbers of Mexican people, not just the male workers, but also the families are starting to come. And So we see this first in South Chicago, where Our Lady of Guadalupe is, and in the near west side, like where St. Francis of Assisi is, or the U of I campus since the 1960s, and a smaller enclave in back of the yards as well. And so by like 1922, 23, 24, there's year round people here. They're sending their kids mostly to public school, starting to adapt and adopt some English words into their day to day language. And they're, in this process of, in small ways, of becoming Chicagoans,
Mm.
but also wanting to maintain a Mexican identity and the majority of them, I argue, were Catholic people.
Yeah.
And this is also a time of religious persecution in Mexico. 1924 to 1927 is the Cristero War, where the Mexican government goes after the Catholic Church really quite violently. And so many of the people who end up in Chicago, they came for work, but it also, life in their home communities and cities becomes untenable. It's literally dangerous. And if you wanted to give your children a Catholic education, you wanted to be able to go to Mass every Sunday or more frequently, you can't do that in Mexico in that time period. And so they go to places like Chicago, San Antonio, Los Angeles as an act of refuge. But then the majority of them stay. And
Mm.
so you've got that really pioneering generation that comes like in the 20s. And we have, you know, tens of thousands of people in Chicago who are like the fourth and fifth generation descendants of those people. So
As of
it's a
today.
deep Chicago story.
Yeah. Somewhere along the line, I ran across a statistic from you that in the 20s, the single largest employer of Mexican was the Ford Motor Company. That just,
Yeah, so in the entire United States, they were being recruited to work in Detroit, and that was a big employer. I think if you were going to talk about like what areas people worked in the most in Chicago, it's probably the railroads.
okay, okay.
And so there were railroad outposts, all around the city, and of course, in the area, sort of surrounding the loop. Like we still see that footprint of the train yards,
Mm,
although it's a much smaller
right,
thing today than it was 100 years
right,
ago.
right. Well, there's that Carl Sandburg poem about Chicago is the stacker of railroads or some such thing, isn't that?
Yep,
Yeah.
and increasingly those stackers were people from Mexico.
Is that right? Yeah,
So,
okay. Now
yeah.
we're talking a Mexican settlement. Other Hispanic nationalities, or was that a later phenomenon in the
It's a
Chicago?
later phenomenon. It's a pretty much when you're talking about Chicago and Catholic Chicago, it's a Mexican story until after World War II. And that's the point in which Puerto Rican people begin to arrive in Chicago.
Okay.
And again, it's a story that begins with labor recruitment. The Puerto Rican government is kind of interested in getting excess population off the island. They're looking to get people into modern or factory jobs. And so that's one of the reasons why the Puerto Rican population begins to grow in Chicago in the late 1940s.
Okay.
And so initially, it's a very big Mexican population, a small Puerto Rican population. But there's a kind of an interesting inflection point, maybe about 1960. Chicago had fairly equal numbers of people who were Puerto Rican and people who were Mexican and Mexican American.
Is that right?
And so that's a really kind of an interesting moment. But the church structures in Chicago were created really to serve the Mexicanos that came in the 1920s. So you get two churches that are created to serve Spanish speaking, St. Francis of Assisi, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the Puerto Ricans, they come into St. Francis of Assisi. They're accepted, but it's not exactly a Puerto Rican church. And there was never really a Puerto Rican Catholic church. They always were sort of working with other groups, and not all their traditions
Mm,
were
yeah.
included in the same way that, like, the Virgin of Guadalupe was really sort of brought into Mexican
Yeah,
churches in
okay.
Chicago.
Now, somewhere along the line, in terms of the interaction with the Catholic Church in Chicago, Cardinal Mundelein plays a role. Where does he enter, and what's he got to do with the welcoming the
So
immigrants?
he had been informed that Mexicans were arriving in Chicago going back to maybe like 1918. There was a Claretian missionary priest who was aware of the Mexicans who were moving north to Chicago. This was a man named Father Saldivar, who was actually a confessor to uh, St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, who also intervenes with Mundelein. And it takes a few years. But finally, Mundelein decides, yes, we need to have ministry to welcome this sort of newest ethnic group to Chicago. We already have parishes for Poles. We have parishes for Italians, Croatians, Lithuanians. And in 1924 and 27, they set up the Spanish-speaking parishes in South Chicago and the Near West Side.
Okay.
The
And,
Mundeleins he's a supporter, and the archdiocese did not want to do that work themselves in the 1920s. They picked a missionary order. This is a pretty common story, to pick a missionary order that spoke the language of the new coming people. The Claretians were an order originally from Spain. They had worked in Mexico for a couple decades. They knew Mexican people. They'd been working with Mexican people in Texas, in California, and in 1924, they set up shop in Chicago. And the Claretians basically run all of the Spanish speaking ministry from the 20s up until about 1960. And that's kind of a turning point in the story I tell in Chicago Catolico. The Latino population is really growing so much. People are moving beyond those enclaves of South Chicago and the Near West Side. The Near West Side neighborhood is actually destroyed to build the U of I, and people begin moving into other neighborhoods. And their parishes are not places that are like ready to necessarily serve them. And so it's an interesting period in the 1960s and 70s as Spanish speakers move into um, parishes that belong to basically other national groups
mm,
and where the other languages are common.
and what was although I suppose far and away the majority were Roman Catholics, what's the outreach or the presence of Protestant denominations in terms of the Mexican immigrants?
So if you go back to the very beginning to, the 1920s, there were iglesias protestantes, evangelicos, there were even Menonitas, Mennonites. Um, this presence was, we know of about maybe like five or six of them in the near west side in the 20s and 30s, but their memberships were quite small. So, like altogether, they maybe had a couple hundred members, and they were important to people who were members,
Mm,
but they weren't, I don't think that, there was a huge evangelical growth, the way that it's sort of very clearly a presence today.
mm,
And I think that there's probably also an important story when the Puerto Ricans come, because the Puerto Ricans, even back on the island, have a pretty high proportion of evangelicals. Like we go back to the mid 20th century, maybe 25% of Puerto Ricans were protestantes
mm-hmm,
of some form. And so I think that that's one of the things that leads to the growth of evangelical churches in Chicago, which we see in so many neighborhoods today,
mm-hmm,
right? And throughout the last, 50 years, the growth of evangelical churches in Latin America, it's a presence in Mexico, but it's a much smaller percentage than it is in, let's say, Guatemala,
mm,
right? Chicago now has a lot of people from Guatemala.
right.
Guatemala is like 40% Protestant.
Mm,
So and the percentage of Protestants in Brazil is very high. They export pastors to the United States. So that's a whole nother story, is
mm,
that changing, and I think more diverse religious landscape in Chicago.
mm, mm. Now, in Chicago Catolico, you tell tales of life in the neighborhoods in the 30s and 40s. Um, what 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 was it like back then, if there's a way to generalize?
Well, one of the things that was really fun for me to find out about, I don't know, I was growing up in Oak Park. It was a lot of Catholic people where I grew up. Most people were parishioners at St. Giles. I kind of got it. The kids that I went to public school with, they went to CCD, they went to mass on the weekends. Okay, I understood that. I was not raised Catholic. What was amazing in looking at the story of these early Spanish-speaking parishes in Chicago, it was almost like a 24/7 kind of thing. People could go to the church basically any time of the day, any day of the week. There tended to be something going on. And so, in the case of St. Francis of Assisi, which still stands, it's often referred to as La Catedral Mexicana on Roosevelt Road. They people went for there were daily masses at different times of the day. There were novenas throughout the year. People also just walked in and did their own prayers to certain images. And St. Francis of Assisi built a gym for the Mexican American youth. And the gym was a very popular location. The building still stands behind where the church is on Newberry Street. And you had young men and young women coming in to play basketball and volleyball and take classes and have radio clubs and use the showers. And just like the churches were such an important center of community.
Mm.
And like in a way that was just unimaginable to me.
Yeah. Is that, I mean, do we depict that as the golden age, that something that we should go back to, or
Well,
what?
and I think it was a story for a lot of Chicagoans.
Mm.
Whether you were Polish or Lithuanian or Irish, I just think that these urban parishes, people lived in really dense neighborhoods, right? Big families, pretty small apartments, and then there was, of course, the bungalow belts where people were big families and little houses, but everybody lived within walking distance to their parish.
Sure.
So, and everybody knew the parish priest, and there were, of course, several priests who assisted him,
Mm.
right? And then there was every parish had a school, which meant it had a convent right there. I mean, these parishes, for people who grew up in the suburbs, I think it's really hard to imagine the way a parish ended up taking up a full city block.
Yeah.
It was like the center of a little village.
Yeah.
And so I just think so many things have changed as Americans have become car dependent, people move to the suburbs, families are smaller, Catholic schooling is not as common. Um, yeah,
It's a different
lots of
world.
reasons why things have
It's
changed.
a different world.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
I certainly want to. You've got a book coming out. What, in a couple weeks?
yeah,
October
like
7?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Okay. And that book is Pioneers of Latino Ministry: Claretians in the Evolving World of Catholic America.
There we go.
You got it. Okay. All right. Why this book? What's it about? And what do you want us to learn?
So I've mentioned the Claretians a couple times. They're essential to the story of the Catholic Church in Chicago. They came to Chicago in the 1920s, but the Claretians, I found that they pioneered Latino ministry throughout the country. They were in many different regions. When the Claretians came to the U.S., 1902, they first came to Texas to minister to Mexican people. They were invited in by the Bishop of San Antonio to do the kind of ministry that nobody else was doing. The church in the United States barely recognized Spanish speaking Catholics, especially beyond the Southwest. Um, and so the Claretians, they ended up going to places, rural Texas, Texas cities, Chicago, California, New Jersey, Oregon, Kansas. Um, any place a bishop invited them to, they went.
Mm.
Sometimes they were relatively temporary missions. Um, they were invited to Milwaukee in the 1920s, and they kind of would take the trains up to the Milwaukee, and they would celebrate Mass and hear confessions. But within, I think, a half a year, it got sort of handed back to the Milwaukee church to
Mm.
take care
Mm-hmm.
of. So Pioneers of Latino Ministry, the book, it's the first book-length history of the Claretian missionaries in the United States and beyond their story of accompanying Latino immigrants and their children throughout the United States. Beyond that story of, sort of working specifically with Spanish-speaking people and their descendants, they also played a large role in the wider American Catholic story. Um, Anybody from Chicago, and really kind of anybody Catholic in the United States, knows about the St. Jude devotion. The St. Jude devotion came out of the Claretians' work in South Chicago. And it's funny, the St. Jude devotion has become a really big deal in Mexico in like the last 20 years. That came from the Claretians in Chicago to Mexico City, which people don't really know about.
Mm.
Um, and so telling this story, it helps us understand American Catholicism. It helps us understand individual locations like San Antonio, Chicago, LA. And it helps us understand a lot about that you know, kind of on the edge place of Latino Catholics that often dioceses did not really want to handle the work themselves. Oh, we don't have the men that can speak Spanish, so please, Claretians, come in and do the work. And some dioceses treated them really well and really supported their efforts. You get churches that are built from scratch, brick and mortar churches. Other places, it was kind of a more uneasy kind of relationship. Um, and one of the things that I get to tell in Pioneers of Latino Ministry, which is really fascinating, is I get to highlight the biographies of many um, of the first Mexican American priests in the United States,
Okay.
priests, brothers.
So how far back,
About sisters.
in general, is there a way to generalize how far back you're going with who those men are?
So the Claretians initially rely on Spaniards, men from Spain,
Mhm.
but they set up seminaries in the 1920s. There's one that's built outside of Chicago, 33, I think is the year. This is St. Jude Seminary in Momence, Illinois, near Kankakee.
Okay.
And so they begin training American boys for the priesthood. And compared to any other religious congregation, they had a higher proportion of boys that came from Spanish-speaking
Yeah.
families.
Okay.
And it's really kind of striking. And it took a long time, for example, in the Chicago area, for the archdiocese to really begin to, I think, recruit and support vocations that came from Spanish-speaking families. And the Claretians had been doing that already a couple decades before.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Now I have to ask. I mean, you've obviously interviewed a lot of Claretians. What's their take on your book? Are they honored, or are
They
they?
seem really excited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I have published small pieces along the way and blogs and little articles.
Mm.
So they've seen pieces of it.
Good.
And I think they're really thrilled that outsiders are noticing. They've always been a relatively small congregation. At their height, I think they were 250 men,
Okay.
which, compare that to the Jesuits.
Right. Right.
Like, they're small.
Yeah.
In a way, it might be a little more akin to the Augustinians who we're all thinking about these days.
Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah.
And I feel that, I finished writing this book a year before Pope Leo was named to the papacy. And I feel like I understand how a boy from the south side of Chicago, from the south suburbs of Chicago, how he becomes a missionary in Peru,
Mm-hmm.
a bishop,
Mm-hmm.
and like makes his way, to higher echelons. It makes sense. The Claretians were doing a lot of the same kinds of work in Chicago, getting young teens involved with thinking about being missionary priests
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about service in other countries.
Yeah.
The Claretians, for a long time, for a couple decades, they ran missions in Guatemala. And there were very strong connections between the Chicago Claretians and a string of parishes in eastern Guatemala.
I want to. I'm cognizant of the time, and you've been very gracious with your time. But before we go, a couple couple of questions in terms of takeaways. And one is, and I was remiss in not mentioning this, but I was first able to see one of your presentations. You were the Palic lecturer a couple years ago at
3
years. Okay,
years ago.
so that video, if anybody who's out there looking through the archives of YouTube, that's the Palic, P-A-L-U-C-H lecture at University of St. Mary of the Lake. And as you say, 2023 or 2022?
I think it's 2022.
Okay, but it was a great overview. It is a great overview, to my mind, of Chicago Catolico. Is that fair to say? It's a good introduction to
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
So there's that. So I endorse that and commend that to the listeners here. The big question here is, what is the takeaway? What does this history teach us about today? What does it provide us in terms of what we ought to be doing? What do we know from this? It's certainly not just a dry history, but history has life and serves us today. What's the service here that we gather?
Great question. One thing that people have to understand, that Spanish-speaking Catholics in Chicago, this is not a new story. You know, Chicago gets its first bishop in 1844, Bishop Porter. There's 180 years of Catholic presence in Chicago. Latinos have been part of that presence for a century, right? The first church opening up in 1924, and the Claretians being there as part of it for 100 years. And I would say overall, the story that we get about Chicago is that Catholic Chicago has basically been a history of welcome, of refuge, of homemaking, if imperfect. You know, there were always priests that were a little uneasy with Spanish-speaking people. But Chicago can be a model for the rest of the country. You know, Chicago began this process of including Spanish-speaking people 100 years ago. Well, this is playing out now in Iowa and in Alabama and in Mississippi and in Montana. So Chicago did this a long time ago. And I think another lesson that we can get out of this, especially in the chapters that I wrote in Chicago Catolico about the Mexican move into Pilsen, what we saw there is that clergy really have the possibility to be leaders for faith communities, that their attitudes and their actions can really make a big difference in terms of creating a welcoming community. And I think, you know, I've been paying a lot of attention to the news from Chicago in the last month. And, you know, we're in this period of very intense immigration enforcement and a lot of really hateful speech and spins on things. And, you know, churches are a place where immigrants from other country can be included. I think it's the job of people that work at parishes and work in the archdiocese, you know, to think about meaningful ways to really welcome people. You know, it's more than learning Spanish on Duolingo. It's also learning culture. I think that the whole archdiocese, you know, should be standing up in different meaningful ways for immigrant peoples and their families. You know, Chicago's got a really robust pastoral migratoria. It shouldn't be the job of just that office to create a sense of welcome and programs that truly support people whose families and well-being are at risk right now. So yeah, my words for people who might be listening: listen to people from Latin America, accompany, support them, figure out how to do this work in meaningful and ongoing ways.
Deborah, I want to thank you so much for your scholarship here, your hard work, your years of digging through ecclesiastical documents handwritten from the 18th century and bringing you forward to today. I think this is valuable work, and I know we're going to be sharing it with with the deacons and the deacons' wives in the days to come. So many blessings on you and your work, and best of luck for that New York Times bestseller that's going to come out in a couple of days. And that's available through, that's New York University Press. Am I remembering that?
Yeah,
right?
and that means you can buy it on Amazon,
Yeah.
Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
You can order it from local bookstores.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very
Yep.
much looking forward to that. And God bless you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Not to be served, but to serve.